On this episode of Inside the Octagon, we dissect the UFC 249 main event. Tony El Cucuy Ferguson versus Justin the Highlight Gaethje, as two of the lightweight division's best go head-to-head for the interim title. Riding a formidable 12-fight win streak, Ferguson has been devastating in his run to the title.
Tony Ferguson by knockout!
And having seen his date with the champion Khabib Nurmagomedov called off, he now finds a new obstacle in his path to gold. Gaethje goes to war every time he pulls on the gloves and has knocked out his last three opponents.
Justin Gaethje with his ultimate highlight!
The highlight has also earned bonus checks in all of his UFC fights and will undoubtedly put on a show for the biggest fight of his career in Florida. The UFC 249 breakdown starts now. Hello and welcome to a very unique Inside the Octagon. My name's John Gooden alongside Dan Hardy. Obviously, we are not side by side, but we are still going to bring you the great analysis for this wonderful and unique UFC 249 event. Dan, we have Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. First up, Tony Ferguson. Haven't seen him for about a year. Never seems to really matter. Always such an exciting fighter to analyse, though.
Yeah, there are so many diversities to his game, and we try and predict what Tony Ferguson's going to do, but I'm not even sure Tony knows, which makes our jobs even more challenging. A lot of different skills in his game, a lot of different threats to Justin Gaethje in this fight, as there would have been to Khabib if that fight had gone down. A lot of similarities in the opponents as well with Justin Gaethje, which I think will make Tony Ferguson's job a little easier because he can use a lot of the same kind of things that he would have done against Khabib. The difference is obviously I don't think the wrestling offensive is going to be the same. It's all about that right hand from Gaethje this time.
And on to Justin Gaethje then, a man who has said several times before he's not willing to take a short notice fight with the UFC, but an opportunity here no less to get onto some interim UFC gold. And Dan, you spoke with him this week as well. What does he make of this situation and how excited is he?
Well, I think obviously he recognises this as a fantastic opportunity and a very unique circumstance, and a situation that he was never going to turn down, because why would you? What was interesting about the conversation, though, is I asked him about the short notice opponent. I asked him about, whether Tony or Khabib were his favoured short notice opponents, and he actually said to me, I wouldn't have taken a short notice fight against Khabib. But with Tony, I feel like I can land a fist on his chin much easier. So, I think he expects the opportunities in the Tony Ferguson fight to be much greater, whereas obviously with a Khabib fight, he's got to make sure his wrestling scrambles are on point for a full 25 minutes. So as far as short notice opponents go, he's lucky it was Ferguson and not Khabib in his own mind.
That's great. And another thing that kind of says to me is that he might be willing to take more risks in this as well, which makes it as exciting. A man that has gotten a bonus every single time he stepped into the octagon, and Tony Ferguson, well, he's on a hell of a win streak. Let's pull up the facts and the stats, then put these guys side by side. Interim lightweight gold is on the line for this one. And Dan, just looking at the two personalities there, the physicalities as well, I think the thing that really jumps off the page is the fact that Tony Ferguson has a 76-inch reach. That is a 6-inch advantage. And that does really play into his strengths as a fighter as well.
Yeah, it does. There's a lot of reasons why those long arms of Tony Ferguson are beneficial. He's got very broad shoulders as well. We talk about the two different body types. You're either a Dorito or a fish finger, and Tony Ferguson's definitely the Dorito in this occasion. He's got very wide shoulders, very narrow waist. What that allows him to do in the striking range, it allows him to sting people from a greater distance. We saw this in the Cowboy fight. Every time Cowboy looked to start to reset, he was just tagged in the face by Tony, who's very loose, he's very fluid, he comes from very unusual angles as well. So utilising that reach advantage in the striking range is going to be a big key for him in this fight. But then at the same time, when it comes to the grappling exchanges, that reach advantage is beneficial because he loves a Darce choker, an anaconda. So anything with a head and arm involved, those long arms are going to be beneficial in cinching that up and making it nice and tight.
You mentioned a Darce choke. We can see there with the facts and the stats that he does have a record-breaking amount of attempts on that one and landing it. But really what we see in this table is it's dominated by striking statistics for both fighters. What really jumps off of the page for you? Because for me, Dan, although there's a lot on the side of Justin Gaethje, which says about his output, he does take a lot of shots as well. And then when you compare that the other side, it makes for some quite interesting analysis.
Well, I think if we compare the two Justin Gaethjes, the one up until the end of his second loss, those first 3 fights in the UFC, the win over Johnson and then the 2 losses he picked up, that Justin Gaethje was far more happy to take shots, to put himself in harm's way, to be the highlight reel fighter, to get those bonuses. And I think, after those couple of losses, he realised he had to reassess his approach, and it's made him more strategic, more not necessarily more cautious. He still takes a lot of risks, but he's just not as willing to take shots on his forehead now. He's much better at getting his head off the centre line, coming over and coming round. And, if you're fighting someone with long reach and the person that you're fighting is constantly getting inside your reach and getting close to you, that makes you feel very claustrophobic. It forces you back against the fence. And that's what Justin Gaethje does so well. Even against taller guys, like when he fought James Vick, getting close to him, getting inside his reach, making him feel pressured, it negates that reach advantage. And the truth is, this game plan for Gaethje is very, very straightforward. It's a very straightforward game plan. It's Tony Ferguson that's the unpredictable one here. If you're Justin Gaethje, you go, right, I need to use my wrestling to keep this fight standing. I need to force him onto my right hand, and I need to slow him down by chopping into his legs with low kicks. That's the stat that really stands out for me, is Justin Gaethje leading the way on low kicks. Because if you're fighting someone like Tony Ferguson, who uses that unpredictability, that footwork, that bounding, who's also had knee injuries in the past as well, those low kicks are going to be a big story. So Gaethje being able to chop into that lead leg is going to make Tony much more of a sitting duck for the right hand.
Nice. Well, I think all of this segues very nicely, particularly when we consider the reaches of Tony Ferguson, who we're going to pull up first, Dan. If there's ever a fight to use those physicalities, this has got to be the one. I know that we're talking about a more strategic Justin Gaethje, but he is still a face-first kind of fighter. So what do you see from Ferguson in his catalogue of Octagon appearances that he'll be using on this weekend?
I think if it's up to Tony Ferguson, it's all the long-range stuff. What we've seen in his last couple of fights in particular is a focus on the midsection and slowing forward pressure down. The thing is with Gaethje, you can guarantee he's going to move forward. That's what he does. So with Tony Ferguson, if he can use those long-range punches to create that distance and use that front kick to the midsection over and over again, that's where he maintains the distance between the two, and that's where he stays safe from that right hand of Gaethje's. It's those long-range techniques are much more about wearing Gaethje down, frustrating him and trying to hurt him. And front kicks to the midsection, as we've seen several times. We go back to the Chad Mendes-Conor McGregor fight.
Yeah.
Like, you can change the landscape of a fight by jabbing someone in the midsection to the point where they're just sick of stepping forward and getting winded. And the other thing we see with Justin Gaethje as well is when he does get hit in the midsection, he does tend to drop his head and tuck his hands up. And if I'm Tony Ferguson, I'm thinking there are a lot of benefits from making Justin Gaethje use that defense. For the elbows, for the overbearing attacks like the neck attacks. It all comes off those long-range prodding techniques where Justin Gaethje never feels like he can get close to Ferguson there.
That's a very good point, Dan. And I think also just to hang on the point about the conditioning of these fighters, and it's never really in doubt for either, but this one, the water is a little bit muddier, but for sure, if Ferguson goes digging away at that body, it's going to have a more depleted Gaethje coming out in a second, third, fourth, and possibly fifth rounds if we get there. But let's now talk about Justin Gaethje then, and really the genetics of his game are being a hard-nosed fighter with power. But I'm sure you're going to give us the more genius side of his forward pressure and his ability to close that space.
Well, like I was saying with Gaethje, that there's two sides to his game, and we're into the second stage now. Maybe even the third stage if we really go back and analyse his early career. But he got 18 fights into his career without changing anything. And I discussed this with him yesterday as well. He didn't need to change anything. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Everything that he was doing was working. But in the back of his head, he also knew that style was finite, that it was going to come to a stage where he was going to take too many shots or someone was just going to be able to put him to sleep. So in the back of his head, he knew that there was going to come a stage where this evolution would have to come, but he was kind of waiting until it was forced upon him. And that's what we saw with those two losses. The Alvarez fight and the Poirier fight, he fought very, very similar in both of those fights. He was pushing forward, he was taking shots he didn't need to take. And those two losses really changed his game. So now this version of Justin Gaethje he's not as willing to put his face on the line. He's not as willing to take a shot to land a shot. One thing that did concern me, he said, is that he's looking forward to Tony Ferguson breaking his nose so he can get it fixed, so he can breathe through it. So, I mean, there might be a bit of he might be a bit hard-headed in that first round, but I think he realises over 25 minutes he can't be taking damage from Tony Ferguson. Because, I mean, look at Tony Ferguson's last 2 fights. They were stopped at the end of the second round because of damage that he'd caused. Like, if you get to the end of the second round with that kind of damage, you haven't got 1 round to go. You've got 3 more rounds to go in a championship fight. And that can be a game changer in this equation, especially because we know Gaethje's got scar tissue. So that cautious forward pressure where he's looking to, cut people down, batter Tony's lead leg with that low kick and take that movement away, take that unpredictability of darting from one side to another, make him much more of a sitting duck, and then start setting up the overhand right. He knows he has power in that overhand right. And there was one other thing that stuck out in my mind, which I don't know whether this is common knowledge. I don't know whether this is much more of an insight into his earlier game than what we're seeing from Gaethje now. But he had an eye surgery. And he was saying that before he had the eye surgery, he would have to get his hands on his opponent to know where they were. Like, his eyesight was so bad that he actually had to physically be in contact with his opponent to know what he was hitting. Now he's had the eye surgery, he's got perfect 20/20 vision, so he's lining up these guys perfectly with that right hand. He's got the depth of perceptions down, he's got the judgment of distance down, he's able to see them better and clearer, even to the small things like reading facial expressions. Like, you can look at a fighter's face that's under pressure and kind of get an idea which direction they're moving. If you can't see their eyes, then you don't get those reads. So it's almost like he's got this whole new skill set that's been delivered to him just purely because he's got 20/20 vision now.
And not just a skill set, a sense. And that's incredible, the fact that he's now quite literally corrected that. Well, that's exciting. Dan, time now to look back at Tony Ferguson. And when I think about him, I really feel like he's a bit of a lightweight version of John Jones in many respects, given his physicalities and his creativity. We spoke a second ago about how he can do really great work at range, but actually he can do some serious damage when he comes into the mid-range and those short ranges as well.
Well, this is the thing with Tony Ferguson, is that there isn't really a favoured range for Tony Ferguson. He'll go wherever the fight goes. He doesn't necessarily need to lead the fight in a particular direction. Like, he's not going to get in there with Justin Gaethje and think, okay, I need to start setting up my neck attacks because the only way I'm going to finish this guy is by choking him unconscious. Tony will just get in there and just start flowing. If he can land elbows, if he can land spinning elbows, if those front kicks to the midsection are working, he'll use them, absolutely. It's the second stage of that. If Tony's either put under pressure, so now he feels himself backed up against the fence and Gaethje's getting in his personal space, or on the flip side, and we've seen this from both of these fighters, if Justin Gaethje's hurt, if he catches him with a spinning elbow as he's crashing forward, Gaethje's legs go, this is where Tony starts to then progress into a closer range. And this is where he does get very dangerous. I mean, he has razor-like elbows. He seems to be able to crack people with one elbow and completely change the fight. Even, like, you even go back to the Pettis fight. Like, the point where he hit Pettis with that cutting elbow, I'm pretty sure he'd already been hurt. And he was, like, tumbling and rolling to get to safety. Still managed to land an elbow because the point that they landed on the floor, the commentators were saying, Tony Ferguson's bleeding from the mouth, he's cut really bad. Because the assumption was that he'd taken a shot that had done damage. In actuality, if you watch the scramble back in slow motion, he lands an elbow that does more damage to Pettis when he's hurt. So, like, you can never second guess when Tony's going to throw something and what he's going to throw. Makes him very, very dangerous. The one thing I would say with the likeness to John Jones, I can see a lot of similarities because of the diversity in their game. Technically, I would say that Tony's still quite reckless on the feet. Like, if I watch Tony's videos, I like to imagine that he's not fighting anybody. I picture Tony Ferguson in the octagon on his own shadowboxing. And, I mean, his chin's up, he's wild, his shots are coming from all different angles. There are big holes in Tony Ferguson's game that someone with the one-punch power of Gaethje can really capitalise on. So that's the concern for me, is that the unpredictabilities of Tony Ferguson's game, as effective as they are, it does also leave him vulnerable to the power of Gaethje.
Fantastic stuff. But such a fascinating matchup, Dan. We are only halfway through, folks. We're going to take a break now. Stay with us for more on this UFC 249 main event on the other side. Welcome back to UFC Inside the Octagon. We are halfway through the analysis for this intriguing matchup for the interim lightweight gold. Dan, Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. What have we learned so far?
Well, the two ranges of Tony Ferguson's striking game kind of bookend the method that Gaethje will be using in that first round. Obviously, Tony Ferguson's got the reach advantage, a lot of unpredictabilities to his game as well, so I expect him to use his long-range strikes as much as he can until he either A, hurts Gaethje, or B, finds himself under too much pressure, and then he switches to that next range, which are the elbows, spinning elbows, or the cutting, dangerous close-range attacks. For Gaethje, it's quite straightforward. It's all about, taking Tony Ferguson's footwork away by smashing that lead leg and then using that long left hook to scoop him onto the powerful right hand that we've seen. Far more straightforward for Gaethje. The unpredictabilities and the randomness, if you like, is in Tony Ferguson's game.
Well, let's move on to some more detail on Gaethje, someone that we haven't looked at here on Inside the Octagon before. And one aspect, big aspect of his game that really comes to mind when I think about him, Dan, is that he really is a bully. When it comes into the short ranges, he's very, very good at those tie-ups and excellent dirty boxing, finding clean shots, which just completely changed the landscape of those fights. What have you seen that he can employ out of that kind of skill set against someone like Ferguson?
Well, I think if Tony Ferguson doesn't really want to be backed up against the fence, he doesn't want to be trapped, because that's where his unpredictabilities don't work. So if I'm Justin Gaethje and I'm dealing with some unpredictability, I'm going to try and take away as much space as possible. Now, Gaethje knows that he can land that right hand on Tony Ferguson's chin and knock him out, but there are far more risks in trying to land that right hand in the first round. What I'm thinking if I'm Gaethje is if I can beat that lead leg up and slow his legs down, and I can tie him up against the fence and kind of maul him up against the fence, get your head position in there, wrap his arms up, land some short shots to the midsection, knees to the legs. I don't think Tony Ferguson's going to necessarily slow down, but I certainly think it allows Gaethje to find his way into the fight and get into a range which is safer for him to land shots. If he does decide to use his wrestling, obviously, he's got he's in a good position to get takedowns against the fence, but the truth is I think he uses his wrestling in this fight to control Tony in the standing range, keep him standing, but also tie him up and tire him out. I mean, the thing is, we think of Justin Gaethje, he's got great wrestling credentials. Really, his wrestling is used to land shots. Very rarely do we see him, put somebody on the ground, beat him up on the floor, and especially because he's fighting Tony Ferguson in this one. I just don't see him. I don't see him engaging in that ground game at all. I think tying him up against the fence is about as much grappling as we're going to see Gaethje opt to do.
All right, Dan. Tony Ferguson, you cannot underline enough how creative this guy is. How else do you think, out of that very, very elaborate, creative martial arts mind that he's got, how else do you think that he might be able to finish this fight?
Well, as we know, a big part of Tony Ferguson's game are his submissions. I just don't see him being in a position in this fight, unless he's hurt Gaethje and he scrambles for a takedown and then starts working for a sub. I don't see him getting a takedown and finishing a takedown to complete, to completion where he can get a submission working. I don't think Tony Ferguson can wrestle Gaethje to the ground and control him there. So for Tony Ferguson and his submissions game, it's about either hurting Gaethje and then wrapping him up and dragging him to the floor, or just wrapping him up. We talked earlier in the show about when you attack Gaethje, he has a bad habit of dropping his head, tucking his hands up. Like, if you're Tony Ferguson, and I know it says they're both 5'11", but the way they fight makes Tony Ferguson the taller fighter here. Gaethje's going to lower his level, he's going to widen his stance, and he's going to make that head presentable for those elbows coming around the side of the guard and then the neck attacks. And I mean, there are two fights in particular. Like the Lando Venata one is the one that comes to mind, because like Venata knew what he was trying to do and he was still dragged down to the floor and choked. The other one is Edson Barbosa shooting a double because he was under pressure and then finding himself in a choke. Like, they, in my opinion, are the two scenarios where Tony Ferguson gets his submission. It's either because his striking has led to the exposing of the neck of Gaethje, or he's hurt Gaethje. Gaethje's either shot in for a takedown, or Tony's got the takedown, and then he starts working the same thing. But it's like, Gaethje's not the kind of guy that you can armbar. Like, he's not going to tap to an armbar, a Kimura, a footlock. You've got to take his ear away. So it's all about those neck attacks. Like, take away his option of tapping, just put him to sleep. And Tony Ferguson's smart enough to know that.
Dan, lovely analysis on those, but I've got a couple of other areas of conversation for you now. And one of them's got to be the durability of both of these fighters. We've seen, particularly with Gaethje's time with the UFC, that he has been hurt, but then he still prevailed. It's like Wolverine-like qualities almost. But at the same time, Tony Ferguson, you can say the same thing. Is there a difference in this one? Is there an area of the body, I'm obviously hinting at Tony Ferguson's legs, that Gaethje can do damage where there isn't that recoverability, if that's even a word? What are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, I think, with Gaethje being so effective in the low kicks, and with what we've seen him do to other opponents, even fights where he's lost, like kicking someone in the leg so they fall to the floor and don't want to get back up again. I mean, that shows you how hard those low kicks are. And because of the way that he throws them, he's not throwing them like a whipping. You don't get that slapping sound from a Gaethje low kick because he's already standing on your toes anyway. He's so close to range that he gets his whole shin bone into the meat. Like, that bruising stays for weeks. Like, that doesn't slap and sting. That stays for weeks. So you can guarantee that in a 25-minute fight, it's gonna pay dividends. I feel like he's going to be working that lead leg from the first bell, and I feel like it will slow Tony Ferguson down. It will make his punches a bit more laboured and more predictable. It'll also make him more hittable. So I think that's going to be a big key for Gaethje in this one to make Tony Ferguson more available for the finish. Both of these guys get hurt and they both survive well. The difference between the two, you see Tony Ferguson get hit and hurt, and you're not sure whether he's injured or whether he's Sonic the Hedgehog, because he's like rolling through, he's spinning, he's doing backflips, and then the next thing he's in on a leg and he's attacking an ankle lock, and you're like, hang on, is he hurt? Was he playing possum? I'm not even quite sure at this stage. Justin Gaethje, when he gets hit and hurt, like, you can tell he's hurt because he's reeling. It looks like a drunk on a boat. Like, he's running back and forth across the octagon. His opponents are going to chase him down. There's something very encouraging about seeing Justin Gaethje hurt because you can see he's vulnerable. Whereas Tony Ferguson, he still doesn't seem to have that vulnerability. He still seems very dangerous. And Tony Ferguson's never been stopped with strikes. He's been hurt a couple of times. We've seen him recover against Venata, a short notice fight that he took. We've seen him recover against Pettis. Same thing again, though, is that forward roll defensive thing he does. The times when we've seen Justin Gaethje hurt, he's been saved by the bell or he's not been saved at all. And I think that's where, if Tony Ferguson can land something concuss him, something that will make a difference for the fight, that's where he starts attacking next and he doesn't try and get the strike finish.
Nice one, Dan. Thank you. Incredible insight as always. Listen, if you guys want to keep the conversation going, we've got to be able to find you. Therefore, you have to use the hashtag inside the Octagon. Tweet at UFC Europe. What a fight this is. We've all been dreaming about this one. UFC 249, interim gold is on the line. Enjoy it, my friends. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.